Historians baffled. The frontier was a place where death was normal rather than exceptional, where mortality from disease, violence, exposure, and accidents claimed significant percentage of those who ventured into wilderness territories beyond established settlements. A place where starvation killed settlers whose crops failed, or whose hunting was unsuccessful during seasons when food could not be obtained through trade, making survival dependent on successful agriculture and hunting, that unpredictable conditions could disrupt fatally. Ambushes by hostile forces defending their territories against encroachment killed trappers, traders, and settlers who traveled through contested regions where violence was routine method for resolving conflicts over land and resources. Storms created lethal conditions through blizzards that froze exposed travelers, through flash floods that drowned people crossing rivers, and through tornadoes that destroyed settlements without warning, weather being unpredictable killer that frontier populations could not avoid through preparation alone. Wild animals, including grizzly bears, mountain lions, and wolf packs, attacked humans when circumstances created encounters where predators viewed people as prey or as threats requiring elimination, animal attacks being regular occurrence rather than rare exception in territories where human and animal populations overlapped. Disease spread rapidly through frontier communities, lacking sanitation and medical care, epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and smallpox killing significant portions of isolated populations who had no immunity and no effective treatments for infections that urban populations might have survived through access to physicians. Landscape that killed unprepared through combination of environmental hazards, including extreme temperatures, dangerous terrain, limited water sources, and distances that exceeded human capacity for traveling without adequate supplies, making frontier travel deadly for anyone who miscalculated provisions or who encountered unexpected obstacles during journeys through territories where rescue was unlikely if travelers became stranded. Sets hook by acknowledging that 9 men not only survived frontier's normal dangers, but survived specific incidents that exceeded routine hardships, their experiences involving injuries and circumstances that should have been fatal even by frontier's brutal standards. They survived things no one should survive, including bear maulings that tore bodies apart, multiple gunshot wounds at close range, 30-mile sprints while being pursued by mounted warriors, blizzard burials, cougar attacks, waterfall plunges, mine collapses, and wolf pack assaults, each survival representing outcome that violated contemporary medical understanding about human bodies' limitations, and that created legends whose truthfulness historians still debate, despite documentation suggesting these impossible. Survivals actually occurred in frontier territories where death was normal, but where these 9 men somehow refused to die. The grizzly that should have ended him attacked without warning when Trapper was checking beaver traps along remote stream in 1843, massive bear emerging from brush and charging before man could raise rifle for defensive shot. A trapper ambushed by creature weighing over 600 pounds, whose speed and power made escape impossible once attack began, his only option being attempting to fight animal whose claws and teeth could kill human easily. By massive grizzly whose initial charge knocked him down before he could fire weapon, bear's momentum and weight overwhelming any resistance that unarmed man could offer against predator whose strength exceeded human capabilities by orders of magnitude. Is torn apart through combination of bites that crushed bones and claw strikes that opened deep wounds across his back, legs, and scalp, bear's attack continuing until animal apparently believed Trapper was dead and lost interest. And left for dead by bear that wandered away after mauling, Trapper's companions who heard his screams arriving too late to prevent attack but finding him still breathing despite horrific injuries. Left for dead assessment being reasonable when examining extent of injuries, including shattered leg bones, deep lacerations across back and shoulders, scalp partially separated from skull, and massive blood loss that should have been fatal within minutes. Torn apart so severely that companions believed he would die within hours even if they attempted to move him, their decision to abandon him, reflecting practical calculation that carrying dying man through wilderness would endanger entire party without saving victim, whose injuries appeared unsurvivable, should have ended him immediately through trauma and blood loss, or within days through infection that wilderness injuries inevitably produced when proper medical treatment was unavailable, making his subsequent survival seem impossible to companions who had left him expecting death to claim him before they travelled far from attack site. The crawl across wilderness began when Trapper regained consciousness hours after bear attack and realized his companions had abandoned him to die, his determination to survive, overcoming rational assessment that his injuries made escape impossible. He crawls miles with shattered limbs using upper body strength to drag himself across terrain, when broken leg bones prevented walking, progress being measured in feet per hour when pain and exhaustion forced frequent stops. With shattered bones whose breaks should have prevented any movement but whose incomplete fractures apparently allowed enough structural integrity for supporting dragging motion, his crawling technique distributing weight to avoid putting pressure on destroyed leg. Miles of wilderness separating attack site from nearest trading post where medical assistance might be available, distance seeming impossible to cross for severely injured man whose mobility was reduced to crawling and whose survival depended on reaching help before infection or exposure killed him. Survives infection through improvising treatments using plants and roots whose medicinal properties frontier knowledge had taught him, his crude applications of poultices, apparently preventing gangrene that typically killed victims of severe wilderness injuries, with improvised medicine consisting of moss packed into wounds for absorbing drainage, bark chewed for its antiseptic properties, and plants whose antimicrobial effects he understood through years of frontier experience, making him expert in wilderness survival. Makes it back to civilization after weeks of crawling and dragging himself toward trading post, his arrival shocking trappers who had heard about bear attack and who assumed he had died shortly after being abandoned. Baffling modern doctors who examine historical accounts and cannot explain how he survived blood loss, infection risk, and physical trauma that should have killed him multiple times during journey, his survival suggesting combination of extraordinary physical resilience, frontier medical knowledge, and determination that exceeded what medical science considered possible for severely injured person traveling through wilderness without professional medical care. A lone scout caught in open prairie faced death sentence when war party spotted him crossing grassland where terrain offered no cover for hiding and where his position, miles from nearest timber, made escape seem impossible. A tracker is spotted while conducting reconnaissance mission for military column following days behind, his role requiring him to range far ahead of main force where he could observe potential threats, but where he was vulnerable if discovered by hostile forces. By large war party whose numbers exceeded 30 warriors mounted on horses that could run down any man on foot, their discovery of isolated scout creating tactical situation where his death seemed certain unless he could reach cover or reinforcements before warriors could close distance. With nowhere to hide on flat prairie where grass was too short for concealment and where nearest timber was miles distant, terrain advantages completely favoring pursuers who could see Scout's position and movements clearly. And no horse, because his mount had gone lame hours earlier and had been abandoned when continuing reconnaissance on foot seemed safer than riding injured animal that would fail when speed became necessary. No horse meant he faced mounted warriors whose speed exceeded his maximum running pace by factors that made escape mathematically impossible if warriors pursued seriously rather than merely observing him. Open prairie whose flatness eliminated any terrain features that might have provided defensive positions or obstacles that would slow mounted pursuit. Scout's tactical situation being hopeless when warriors began riding toward him with clear intention of killing isolated enemy whose death would be easy victory. Caught suggesting he had no warning before warriors spotted him, their discovery ending his reconnaissance mission and beginning desperate flight that survival odds suggested would end in his death within minutes. Once mounted warriors closed distance that separated them from Scout, whose only chance was reaching cavalry camp before pursuers caught him on open ground. A 30-mile sprint no human should survive began when Scout realized mounted warriors were pursuing him with intention to kill, his only option being running toward distant cavalry camp, whose location he knew, but whose distance made reaching it before collapse seem impossible. He runs through night using darkness for concealment from pursuers who had to slow pace when visibility decreased, his continued movement during hours when warriors made camp, demonstrating determination that exceeded normal human endurance when facing exhaustion and dehydration. And heat of following day, when sun raised temperatures to levels that made sustained running dangerous through dehydration and heat exhaustion, his flight continuing despite physical suffering that would have stopped less motivated runners. Through night and into day without rest or water, sustained exertion at near maximum pace, producing physical deterioration that should have caused collapse long before 30 miles were covered. Across riverbeds whose crossings required wading or swimming that exhausted already depleted energy reserves, and broken terrain where uneven ground risked ankle injuries that would have ended flight immediately by preventing further running. Broken terrain, including rocky sections, where footing was treacherous and where falls would have been fatal when pursuers were close enough that any delay meant capture and death. Collapsing into cavalry camp moments before dying from complete physical exhaustion and severe dehydration that had pushed his body beyond normal survival limits. His arrival, shocking soldiers who could not believe man had run 30 miles while being pursued by mounted warriors, yet somehow lives despite medical officers' assessment that his physical condition suggested he should die from organ failure caused by extreme exertion and dehydration. His survival over following days, surprising doctors who had expected death from cardiovascular collapse or kidney failure that sustained maximum effort running typically produced when pushed to extremes that Scout had endured during flight from warriors who had pursued until losing his trail. The blizzard that buried him alive struck without warning when hunting party was crossing Mountain Pass in 1860s, sudden whiteout conditions reducing visibility to zero and separating hunters who could not maintain contact in wind and snow, caught in whiteout whose intensity made travel impossible and whose wind chill created life-threatening conditions for anyone exposed without adequate shelter. Hunter became separated from companions who assumed he had frozen when they could not locate him after storm passed. His party assumes he froze based on their experience with blizzard conditions that killed exposed people quickly through combination of hypothermia and disorientation that prevented victims from finding shelter. Assumes he died was reasonable conclusion when searchers could not find him after storm and when his survival seemed impossible given storm's severity and duration that had challenged even hunters who had maintained group cohesion. And abandons him, after brief search revealed no signs of his survival, party's departure, reflecting practical necessity of continuing journey rather than remaining in dangerous location, searching for companion whose death seemed certain. Him, after determining that extended search would endanger living party members without reasonable prospect of finding survivor in vast wilderness, where storm had covered all tracks and where body would not be found until spring thaw if ever. Buried alive, not literally but in sense that snow accumulation during blizzard had covered his position and that his disappearance into storm had made him invisible to searchers who passed near his location without detecting his presence. That buried suggested complete concealment and isolation, where he was cut off from any help and where survival depended entirely on his own resources and knowledge. Storm, having transformed him from member of hunting party into isolated individual whose continued existence was unknown to companions who believed he had perished in blizzard that should have killed anyone caught alone without shelter in, conditions that even prepared groups found life-threatening. The night he dug his own snow tomb began when Hunter realized blizzard would kill him if he remained exposed, his frontier instincts recognizing that snow could provide insulation if properly utilized for creating shelter. Using frontier knowledge about snow's insulating properties that prevented heat loss better than remaining in wind, where convective cooling would cause rapid hypothermia, he begins digging into snowbank that storm was creating against rock outcrop. He builds snow cave by hollowing space large enough for his body, while ensuring ceiling was thick enough for insulation, but not so thick that weight would collapse on him, his construction reflecting understanding of snow shelter principles that frontier experience had taught. Snow cave, whose interior temperature would remain near freezing regardless of exterior conditions that might drop far below zero. Insulation effect of snow preventing interior from cooling to life-threatening temperatures. Avoids hypothermia through staying dry inside shelter, where wind could not reach him and where snow's insulation prevented body heat from escaping, his survival depending on maintaining core temperature above critical threshold, where organ function would fail. Hypothermia prevention, requiring him to remain conscious and to maintain circulation through periodic movement, despite exhaustion and cold, that made inactivity tempting but deadly. And walks back days later after storm passed, and after he emerged from Snow Cave to discover his party had departed, his solo journey back to settlement, requiring navigation skills and endurance, when he was already weakened by days without food. Frostbitten, but alive with damaged tissue on fingers and toes, demonstrating that he had suffered from exposure despite Snow Cave's protection, tissue damage being acceptable price for survival when alternative was freezing to death in blizzard. But alive, describing outcome that astonished his former companions, who had reported his death and who could not believe he had survived storm that they considered unsurvivable for isolated individual without proper shelter or supplies. The ambush on Ridge occurred in 1864, when Scout was guiding military patrol through disputed territory, where hostile forces were known to operate, but where reconnaissance was necessary despite dangers. While guiding patrol, whose safe passage depended on his ability to detect threats before patrol encountered them, he is surprised by warriors who had concealed themselves along route that Scout was following ahead of main force. A patrol that was following 100 yards behind when ambush occurred, distance being too far for immediate support, but close enough that Scout's screams and gunfire alerted soldiers to danger. He is surrounded by warriors who had positioned themselves in semicircle that blocked his escape routes, their tactical setup being designed for killing isolated enemy rather than for capturing prisoner. And hit repeatedly at close range when warriors opened fire from positions within 50 feet, multiple bullets striking him before he could seek cover or return fire effectively. At close range where musket and rifle fire was most accurate and most lethal, warriors concentrated fire, hitting Scout multiple times in torso and limbs before patrol's arrival forced warriors to withdraw rather than completing kill. Repeatedly suggesting multiple wounds rather than single lucky shot, his survival, after being hit 5 times at close range, seeming impossible when any single bullet might have been fatal, depending on which organs or major blood vessels were damaged. Hit by bullets whose impacts should have incapacitated him immediately through shock and pain, even if wounds were not instantly lethal, making his subsequent escape more remarkable when considering that wounded men typically could not move effectively after suffering trauma that he endured. Surrounded and shot multiple times, created tactical situation where death seemed certain, making his survival dependent on factors beyond normal human capabilities, when facing wounds that should have ended his consciousness and his life within minutes of ambush. The blood trail that wouldn't end marked Scout's escape route after being shot 5 times, his bleeding, creating visible track that pursuing warriors followed, expecting to find dying man who could not travel far with such severe wounds. Despite multiple gunshot wounds whose accumulated damage should have caused rapid death through blood loss or organ failure, he uses terrain advantages to evade immediate pursuit by crawling into dense brush where mounted warriors could not follow easily. Deception when he realized blood trail was revealing his position, wrapping wounds with torn clothing to reduce bleeding and periodically changing direction to confuse trackers. And sheer will that kept him moving when pain and blood loss should have caused unconsciousness, his determination to reach safety, overcoming physical damage that would have stopped less motivated survivors. To crawl through brush using cover that standing movement would have exposed him beyond, his reduced profile and vegetation concealment, making him harder to spot when warriors were searching for wounded fugitive. Through dense vegetation that protected him from observation, but that made movement extremely difficult when he was severely wounded and weakening from blood loss, progress being measured in yards per hour when exhaustion and injuries forced frequent rest stops. Until rescued by patrol members who had been searching for him after ambush forced warriors to withdraw, his discovery several hundred yards from ambush site, shocking soldiers who could not believe he had traveled that distance with such severe wounds. Surgeons can't explain his survival when examining wounds that should have been individually fatal and that collectively should have killed him within minutes through blood loss or damage to vital organs. Medical assessment concluding that his survival violated normal trauma outcomes that doctors expected when treating gunshot wounds of severity that Scout had endured while escaping through wilderness that offered no medical care. Stranded after horse collapse left Buffalo Hunter isolated on Great Plains in 1870s when his mount died from exhaustion during hunt that had ranged far from camp. Alone on plains whose vast distances made walking back to camp dangerous when severe weather could strike without warning and when hostile encounters were possible for isolated individuals. With broken leg suffered when horse collapsed and rolled on him, compound fracture preventing normal walking and making his situation desperate when mobility was essential for survival. Broken leg whose bone had pierced skin, creating open wound that would certainly become infected without proper treatment. Compound fracture being among most dangerous injuries that frontier medicine could rarely treat successfully. And no weapon but knife, because his rifle had been lost when horse fell, leaving him defenseless, except for blade that was adequate for close combat, but useless against threats like mounted raiders or predators that could be deterred by firearms. But knife whose presence would prove essential when wolves detected his vulnerability and began stalking him as potential prey, blade being his only means of defense against pack, whose numbers exceeded his ability to fight individually. No weapon beyond knife, reflecting his desperate situation where he lacked tools necessary for signaling rescuers, hunting food, or defending against threats that isolated plainsmen typically faced, making his survival dependent on knife alone when circumstances required firearms for effective defense. Alone and immobilized by broken leg that prevented escape from approaching dangers, Buffalo Hunter faced death sentence when wolves began circling his position, recognizing that injured human represented easy prey. On plains, far from any help where his screams would not be heard and where rescue would require someone specifically searching for him when his absence might not be noticed for days, isolation, making his survival depend entirely on his own resources, when those resources had been reduced to single knife and whatever willpower he could summon for defending himself. The knife fight in snow began at nightfall, when Wolfpack attacked Buffalo Hunter, who had built small fire for warmth and for deterring predators whose approach he had detected during afternoon. He fends off entire pack by improvising torch from burning branches that he used for keeping wolves at distance while stabbing with knife any animal that came within reach, dual weapon technique, allowing him to maintain defensive perimeter around his position. By torchlight that revealed wolves circling just beyond flame's reach and that allowed him to see attacks coming from darkness where pack members were coordinating assault on wounded prey. Entire wolf pack, whose numbers exceeded dozen animals, made coordinated attacks that would have overwhelmed unarmed human, but that Hunter countered through using fire and knife together to create defensive zone. Killing several wolves whose bodies accumulated around his position as night progressed, each successful defense wounding or killing pack member, but also exhausting Hunter, whose blood loss and pain were creating cumulative weakening. Several wolves died from knife wounds when animals pressed attacks close enough that Hunter could strike vital areas, Pack's persistence, suggesting they recognized his weakness and believed they could eventually overwhelm his defense. Before being found by search party that had been looking for him after his extended absence was noticed, rescuers arriving near dawn to discover him still conscious and defending himself despite blood loss that should have caused unconsciousness hours earlier. Historians still debate how he stayed conscious through blood loss from broken leg wound and from defensive fighting that had reopened injuries, medical understanding suggesting that volume of blood lost should have caused shock and unconsciousness long before rescue arrived, making his sustained consciousness throughout night-long defense seem physiologically impossible when examining extent of injuries and estimated blood loss that such wounds would have produced. Swept toward falls was Riverman's fate in 1873, when canoe was caught in current, stronger than he had anticipated, and that was pulling him toward waterfall, whose drop he knew was fatal for anyone going over. Edge. A canoeman caught in rapid that had seemed navigable when he entered, but that had proven more powerful than his paddling could overcome, current's strength making escape impossible once canoe was committed to flow toward falls. is caught when current grabbed canoe and accelerated it toward falls faster than he could paddle toward shore, his realization that he would go over coming too late for any effective response beyond attempting to position canoe for best chance of survival. In rapid, whose power exceeded anything he had experienced previously despite years of river travel, water's force demonstrating nature's superiority over human strength when current could not be overcome through paddling technique or physical effort. That drags him straight toward deadly plunge over falls, whose height exceeded 30 feet, and whose landing pool was filled with rocks that would crush anyone surviving initial drop, making going over falls virtually certain death sentence that experienced river travelers avoided through careful route planning, toward deadly drop that killed most people who went over whether accidentally or intentionally, waterfall's combination of height and rocky landing, making survival dependent on extraordinary luck rather than on skill or preparation. Straight toward indicating he had no opportunity for maneuvering canoe toward safer route, current's power being absolute in its control of his trajectory once he entered flow that led inevitably to falls. Plunge that he could see approaching but could not avoid, his final seconds before going over being spent attempting to position himself for impact that he knew would probably kill him, regardless of how he prepared, making his survival dependent on factors beyond his control, when physics of falling and impact would determine whether he lived or died. The miracle in rapids occurred when Riverman somehow survived going over 30-foot waterfall and landing in pool whose rocks should have crushed him on impact. He goes over falls while still in canoe that was destroyed instantly upon hitting water below, wooden vessel disintegrating and releasing him into churning current at base of waterfall. Over edge, where drop lasted long enough for him to understand, he was falling but too briefly for any effective preparation beyond attempting to protect head during landing he could not control. Breaks bones on impact with water and rocks, multiple fractures resulting from force of landing that exceeded what human skeleton could absorb without damage, his survival depending on avoiding impacts to head and torso, where fatal injuries were most likely. Bones broken, including ribs and arm whose fractures were excruciatingly painful but not immediately fatal, his ability to remain conscious despite trauma and pain, allowing him to attempt escape from current that was still dangerous even after surviving initial fall. And still swims to shore through combination of luck that current pushed him toward bank rather than holding him in dangerous center channel, and determination that kept him moving despite injuries that would have paralyzed less motivated survivors. To shore whose distance was only 50 feet, but seemed infinite when swimming with broken bones in current that was attempting to pull him back into main channel, where he would drown if he could not maintain progress towards safety. Rescuers call it physically impossible when discovering him alive on riverbank, hours after witnesses had seen him go over falls, their assumption being that anyone going over would die either from impact or from drowning when injuries prevented swimming. Physically impossible in sense that surviving fall, landing, and swim seemed to violate what human body could endure when suffering impacts that should have been fatal, making his survival seem miraculous rather than explainable through natural factors that rescuers could understand when examining his injuries that should have killed him multiple times. Buried alive under mountain rock was Prospector's situation in 1878, when mine shaft he was working collapsed without warning, tons of rock and soil filling tunnel and trapping him dozens of feet underground. A mining collapse traps him when timber supports failed suddenly, ceiling fall burying him beneath rubble that filled tunnel and that cut off his escape route to surface. Traps him dozens of feet underground in darkness that was absolute when his lantern was extinguished by falling rock, his burial being complete in sense that no light reached his position and that air supply was limited to whatever oxygen remained in void spaces between rocks. Dozens of feet of overburden separating him from surface, where rescuers might be attempting to reach him, but where their digging would take days if they could locate his position beneath collapsed material, whose volume exceeded hundreds of cubic yards. With no light because lantern had been destroyed or extinguished when ceiling collapsed, darkness being total in underground space where no natural light could penetrate through rock and soil covering tunnel. No light meant he could not see obstacles or assess his situation visually. All navigation and work needing to be done by touch, when eyes provided no useful information, in absolute darkness of underground tomb. Almost no oxygen because rockfall had sealed tunnel, and because remaining air would be consumed through his breathing and through any physical exertion he attempted during escape efforts, oxygen depletion being most immediate threat when he might suffocate before dying from thirst or injuries. And trapped underground where screaming for help would not be heard through dozens of feet of rock, his isolation being complete when he could not communicate with surface, and when rescuers might not even know he was trapped if collapse had occurred in remote location, where his absence might not be noticed immediately. The dig that should have failed began when Prospector realized that waiting for rescue would mean death from suffocation, and that his only chance was attempting to dig upward through collapsed material towards surface. He claws way upward using bare hands when he could not find tools in darkness, his digging creating small vertical shaft through rubble by removing rocks and pushing them into voids behind him. Over days without food, water, or light, sustained effort being maintained through determination that exceeded rational assessment of his situation, where suffocation or collapse of his digging seemed more probable than successful escape. Claws suggesting desperate manual labor rather than systematic engineering, his technique being simple removal of obstacles above him, while hoping that progress was towards surface, rather than merely creating void that would collapse. Upward through rubble whose composition he could only determine by touch, his navigation being guesswork in darkness, where he could not verify whether his digging was ascending or whether he was merely moving horizontally through collapsed material. Navigating in total darkness, where every handhold needed to be tested by touch, and where progress could only be estimated by time spent digging, rather than by visual confirmation of advancement. Until he emerges, after days of sustained digging brought him to surface where his hand broke through final layer of soil into daylight, his emergence shocking anyone who witnessed emaciated man covered in dirt crawling from ground like resurrection, delirious but alive after ordeal that should have killed him through suffocation, dehydration, or burial under collapsing tunnel walls that he had destabilized through digging, his survival seeming impossible when examining conditions he had endured and obstacles he had overcome, through blind digging in absolute darkness, beneath dozens of feet of rock that he had somehow tunneled through without proper tools or without ability to see what he was doing during escape that violated every principle of safe mining practice. The cougar that leapt from ridge attacked Mountain Guide in 1880s when he was hunting elk in terrain, where big cats were known to hunt, but where encounters were rare enough that Guide had not expected to face Mountain Lion. A mountain lion tackles him from ambush position on rock outcrop above trail, cat's attack achieving complete surprise when Guide had no warning before being struck by 100-pound predator. Tackles him during hunt when he was focused on tracking elk rather than watching for threats from above, his distraction allowing cougar to close distance before launching attack that knocked him off his feet. During hunt, whose purpose was finding elk, meant Guide was moving through cougar territory without maintaining vigilance against predators that also hunted in area where their ranges overlapped. From ridge above trail, where cougar had been stalking Guide's movements and waiting for optimal moment to attack, cat's elevated position, providing velocity that added to impact force when it struck Guide's back and shoulders. Leapt covering distance of 15 feet from rock outcrop to trail below, cat's jump being executed perfectly for knocking down human prey whose size exceeded cougar's normal targets, but whose vulnerability, when surprised, made him viable victim. Lion's attack being typical ambush predation where surprise and initial impact were designed to incapacitate prey before it could defend itself effectively, cougar's tactics having evolved for killing deer and elk whose size approximated human dimensions. Tackles suggested violent collision rather than gentle contact, cat's weight and momentum knocking Guide down, while claws sought holds in his flesh, and while jaws attempted to reach neck for killing bite that would have ended fight instantly if cougar could have achieved proper position for delivering fatal wound to Guide, who was struggling desperately to prevent cat from completing its attack. The strangest survival in frontier history occurred when Guide somehow defeated Mountain Lion through wrestling techniques that prevented cat from achieving killing position. He wrestles animal using strength and weight advantage to counter cat's agility and claws, his technique being desperate grappling rather than skilled fighting when training for combat against cougars did not exist. Animal, whose claws were shredding his arms and back while he attempted to control cat's body and to prevent it from biting his neck or severing major blood vessels, uses leverage to break free from initial grappling by rolling and throwing cat off balance, his understanding of body mechanics allowing him to exploit weight advantage despite cougar's superior agility and natural weapons. To break free temporarily when he managed to throw cougar off his body, brief separation, allowing him to regain footing, and to prepare for cat's renewed attack that came immediately when predator was unwilling to abandon prey. Strangles it using technique that he had learned for killing smaller predators, his hands finding purchase on cat's throat and maintaining pressure despite claws that were tearing his forearms during struggle that lasted minutes. And walks away bleeding but alive after cougar went limp from strangulation, his victory over predator seeming impossible when cougars typically killed men who faced them without firearms. Bleeding from dozens of claw wounds and from bites that had torn flesh but that had missed vital blood vessels and organs through combination of guide's defensive movements and through luck that prevented fatal injuries during combat, but alive suggesting outcome that should not have occurred when mountain lion held every advantage in natural weaponry and fighting instinct. An account historians still argue over because Guide's description of fight seems exaggerated when comparing his survival to typical cougar attack outcomes, where victims died or suffered life-threatening injuries. Skepticism about his account, stemming from improbability that unarmed man could defeat mountain lion through hand-to-hand combat without suffering fatal wounds during struggle that should have ended with cougar killing human prey. The capture in Canyon occurred in 1890, when Outlaw was cornered by posse, pursuing him for crimes that would result in hanging if he was taken alive. Cornered by posse whose members were determined to kill him whether he surrendered or resisted, their orders being to bring him back dead rather than alive when transporting dangerous criminal, seemed more risky than executing him on sight. He is shot multiple times when posse opened fire from positions surrounding his location in Box Canyon, whose walls prevented escape. Concentrated fire from multiple directions hitting him several times before he fell. Multiple times suggesting 4 or 5 bullets striking him in torso and limbs, wounds being severe enough that posse members believed they had killed him when he collapsed and stopped moving after being shot. And believed dead by posse whose members did not approach immediately to verify death when they assumed that anyone shot as many times as Outlaw had been would certainly die from wounds even if not killed instantly. Believed dead assessment being based on posse's observation that he had fallen after being hit and that he showed no signs of movement or breathing from distance where they were observing his body. Dead or dying was posse's conclusion when they saw him lying motionless in position where he had fallen after being shot, their assumption being that approaching his body was unnecessary when he would bleed out from wounds within minutes, even if some spark of life remained. In Canyon, where his body would remain until morning, when posse could safely approach in daylight and verify death before transporting corpse back for bounty that was payable whether criminal was brought in alive or dead, making immediate verification seem unnecessary, when waiting was safer than approaching potentially dangerous wounded man in darkness, where he might have energy for final shot, if he retained consciousness. The escape that defied every witness occurred when Outlaw regained consciousness hours after being shot and left for dead by posse that had made camp nearby while waiting for morning to collect his body. Hours later, after blood loss should have killed him, and after he should have been too weak to move even if consciousness returned, Outlaw somehow found strength to begin escape. He crawls out of pile of bodies where posse had thrown other criminals killed during gunfight, his movement going unnoticed by sentries who were watching approaches to camp rather than watching corpse pile, where no threat was expected. Out of pile through slow movement that avoided attracting attention, his crawling being virtually silent when speed would have caused noise that would have alerted posse to his survival and escape attempt. And disappears into brush beyond camp perimeter, where darkness concealed his movements and where his knowledge of terrain allowed him to navigate, despite severe wounds that were causing blood loss and pain that should have prevented. Travel. into brush whose density provided concealment during crawling escape that took him beyond search radius before morning, when posse discovered his absence from corpse pile. Surviving wounds that doctors say should have killed him instantly when examining medical reports describing injuries he had received from multiple gunshot wounds at close range, physicians' assessment being that blood loss and organ damage should have been fatal within minutes of shooting. Instantly or within minutes, according to medical understanding of gunshot trauma, making his survival for hours followed by escape seem physiologically impossible when considering severity of wounds that should have caused rapid death through exsanguination or through damage to vital organs. Defied every witness who had seen him shot and fall, their certainty of his death being contradicted by his subsequent escape that none could explain when examining evidence that he had been shot multiple times and had lain motionless for hours before somehow crawling away through brush, his survival violating witnesses' understanding of what gunshot wounds could do to human body and what injuries were survivable without immediate medical treatment that he did not receive during escape into wilderness, where he disappeared. Why these men should not have lived becomes central question when examining 9 frontier survival accounts whose outcomes violated medical understanding about human bodies' limitations and about injuries that were considered fatal, under conditions where professional medical care was unavailable. These men survived not because of luck alone, though fortune played role in avoiding immediately fatal injuries, but survival resulted from combination of factors that individually were insufficient, but that together created circumstances where impossible became merely improbable. Because of frontier instincts that taught them how to respond to life-threatening situations through using natural materials for treating wounds, through building shelters that prevented exposure deaths, and through understanding terrain that allowed escape when pursuit should have been successful. Brutal resilience that exceeded normal human pain tolerance and that allowed continued movement when injuries should have caused incapacitation, their physical toughness being product of frontier life that selected for individuals whose bodies could endure hardships that would have killed softer men. Desperation that motivated them to attempt survival measures that seemed futile but that offered only alternative to accepting death, their determination to live overcoming rational assessments, suggesting that efforts were wasted when death was inevitable regardless of resistance. And raw will to keep moving when bodies should have quit functioning through exhaustion, blood loss, infection, or trauma, their refusal to surrender to death being psychological factor that medical science could not quantify, but that clearly influenced survival outcomes in ways that physical factors alone could not explain. Historians still debate how many of their stories are even possible when examining accounts that seem exaggerated, until comparing them against documented cases where similar survivals occurred under witnesses who verified details. Yet these legends refused to die despite suffering injuries that killed most men who experienced comparable trauma. Their survival, creating accounts that became frontier mythology, but that were based on actual events, whose improbability made them legendary, while their historical truth made them valuable evidence about human survival capabilities under speaker. Extreme conditions that tested limitations of what bodies and minds could endure when death seemed certain. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.